The island had always lived with the sea like a family member, sometimes gentle, sometimes furious, but always present. Generations had learned its moods, built their homes just beyond its reach, and taught their children to read the clouds like pages in a book. But nothing in their history, no storm, no flood, no drought, could have prepared them for what came that night. It wasn't just a storm. It felt like the sky had cracked open, and the ocean had risen up to swallow the world whole. Cyclone Mela hit without mercy. Wind screamed like something alive, tearing roofs from houses like they were made of paper. Trees bent double and snapped. The sea didn't just rise, it surged inland, swallowing roads, schools, even whole villages in a matter of hours. By morning, the island was unrecognizable. What had been green hills and tidy villages was now a wasteland of mud, splintered wood, and silence, the kind of silence that follows total ruin. In the capital, what was left of the government gathered in a half-collapsed building. Walls were cracked, windows gone, the floor slick with rainwater and mud. The leader of the island, a woman who'd once taught children how to read before stepping into leadership during calmer times, stood in front of a flickering radio. Her clothes were soaked, her hair matted with dust, but her voice was steady as she spoke into the mic. "We are drowning. Please send help." The message went out over every channel they could reach. Satellite phones, emergency radio frequencies, even shaky posts on social media typed on a phone powered by a car battery. No food, no clean water. Hospitals destroyed. Thousands missing. We need medicine, tents, water purifiers, anything. For a few hours, hope flickered. News outlets in faraway countries picked up the story. A big international aid group posted online that they were monitoring the situation. A few governments issued statements saying they were deeply concerned. People across the world shared the island's coordinates, urging action. For a moment, it felt like someone was listening. But then, nothing. The days that followed were slow and cruel. The sun returned, blazing hot, baking the soaked ruins into a landscape of cracked mud and twisted metal. With no clean water, people started drinking from puddles and ditches. Stomach sickness spread fast. Makeshift clinics, just tarps stretched over broken furniture, filled with feverish children and elders too weak to stand. In places, bodies still lay unburied, swelling in the heat. Flies buzzed in thick clouds. Every morning, someone would climb the highest hill left standing, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon for ships. Every evening, they came down shaking their head. No sails, no helicopters, no planes. Meanwhile, the promises from the outside world turned to dust. One wealthy country said their aid shipment was delayed due to port inspections. Another said they couldn't send help because the area was too unstable. A third quietly moved its emergency funds to a different crisis, one that was getting more headlines. Behind closed doors, officials debated whether this small island was worth the investment. Back on the ground, no one cared about politics. They cared about whether their baby would live through the night, whether the last bag of rice would stretch one more meal, whether the cough in their chest was just from smoke or something far worse. A fisherman whose boat had been smashed to kindling spent his days walking the shoreline, not fishing, but searching. He found a child's shoe caught in seaweed. Later, a school notebook, its pages bloated with salt water, drawings of smiling suns and stick-figure families barely visible. He buried them under a flat stone and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken since he was a boy. In what used to be a clinic, a young nurse, barely out of her teens, trained in a rushed emergency course years ago, stitched wounds with fishing line because the last of the medical thread was gone. She worked by candlelight, her hands shaking but sure she hadn't slept in 3 days. When a mother brought in her son with a deep gash on his leg, the nurse didn't have antiseptic, so she boiled seawater, strained it through cloth, and used that. It wasn't perfect, but it was all she had. The island's leader stopped waiting for calls that never came. Instead, she walked from camp to camp, listening more than speaking. She shared her own ration of dried fish. She held the hands of the grieving. She didn't offer empty promises. She just showed up. And in doing so, she became more than a leader. She became a witness to her people's pain. One evening, as the sun bled red over the broken skyline, a teenager climbed onto the roof of what used to be the town library. He held up a small mirror catching the last light, flashing it toward the empty sea, SOS over and over. He didn't know if anyone would see it, but he kept flashing, because stopping meant giving up. And giving up meant letting the silence win. Far away in air-conditioned offices and conference rooms, the island's name was already fading from meeting agendas. New headlines had taken over. Elections, scandals, celebrity gossip. The world moved on, as it often does, forgetting that for some, time doesn't move forward. It stalls in hunger, thirst, and grief. But on the island, time didn't stall. It pressed down, heavy and urgent. Every hour without clean water meant more sickness. Every night without shelter meant more exposure. Every day without outside help meant more lives balanced on a knife's edge. And still no ships came. The people weren't angry in the loud, shouting way outsiders might expect. Their anger was quiet. It lived in the way a mother tucked her child tighter under a wet blanket. In the way an old man stared at the horizon, not with hope, but with a kind of tired knowing. They'd been taught that the world was connected, that when one part suffers, others reach out. But now they were learning a harder truth. Connection only matters if someone chooses to feel it. Yet even in that crushing isolation, something stubborn remained. Not hope exactly, but dignity. They buried their dead with care even when they had no shovels. They shared the last drops of rainwater caught in broken pots. They sang old songs at night not to cheer themselves up, but to remind each other. We are still here. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a place most of the world had written off as broken, dangerous, even cursed, a different kind of listening was happening. Not in polished conference rooms, but in dimly lit rooms with cracked walls and flickering lights. Someone heard the plea, and unlike the rest of the world, they didn't hesitate. But that's a story for later. For now on the island, the night deepened. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of salt and smoke. And in the dark, 100 small acts of courage kept the flame of survival alive. One shared cup of water, one whispered lullaby, one more mirror flashing into the void. They didn't know if help would ever come, but they refused to disappear quietly, not while they still had breath in their lungs and hands that could hold each other. Weeks passed and the world kept turning, but not for the people on the island. What little hope had flickered after the first desperate plea had now dimmed to a faint ember. The international headlines that once mentioned their name had vanished, replaced by flashier crises, political dramas, and celebrity gossip. Aid organizations posted vague updates online, assessing logistics, coordinating with local authorities, prioritizing high-impact zones. To those words, the islanders had no reply, only empty stomachs and worsening fevers. The promised shipments never arrived. One country said their cargo ship was held up in customs. Another claimed their medical team couldn't land because airfield conditions were unsafe, even though locals had cleared the runway with brooms and bare hands. A third quietly redirected its emergency funds to a region with stronger diplomatic ties. No one said it outright, but the message was clear. This small island with no oil, no army, no global influence simply didn't matter enough. Back on the ground, people stopped watching the horizon. They stopped asking when help would come. Instead, they focused on what they could control. Boiling the same water over and over, sharing the last spoonful of rice among 5, using torn bed sheets as bandages. Children learned to stay quiet when they were hungry, so they wouldn't make the adults feel worse. Elders gave up their rations without a word, saying they'd lived long enough. In the capital, what remained of the government met in a tent patched together from plastic tarps and fishing nets. Maps were drawn in the dirt. Lists were made on scraps of wet paper. Every decision was heavy, like choosing which village got the last working water pump, or which clinic received the final box of antibiotics. There were no good choices, only less terrible ones. Meanwhile, online, the island's story had become a footnote. A few activists still posted about it, but their voices were drowned out by louder, trendier causes. Some influencers shared a link once, then moved on. Others questioned whether the island's government was corrupt or inefficient, as if that justified leaving tens of thousands to suffer. The truth was simpler. Helping cost money, time, and attention, and no one powerful stood to gain much from giving it. But while the world looked away, something unexpected was happening far away, in a place most people only knew from grim news reports. In a rugged, Landlocked country scarred by years of drought. Conflict and sanctions, life was harsh but not hopeless. Outsiders called it the Death World, a nickname born from old military reports that painted it as a place too broken to survive. Its cities were dusty, its hospitals understocked, its farms barely clinging to life in cracked earth. Yet its people had learned to make do with almost nothing. They fixed generators with spare parts from old cars. They grew vegetables in rooftop buckets. They trained medics in basements because they couldn't afford proper schools. One evening, in a dimly lit room with peeling paint and a single flickering bulb, a group of officials gathered around a small battered tablet. A grainy video played, footage from the island shot on a phone with a dying battery. It showed children huddled under plastic sheets, a nurse stitching a wound with thread, an old man staring blankly at a pile of rubble that used to be his home. Silence filled the room. One of the leaders, a man who'd once been a field medic during his country's darkest years, watched without blinking. He remembered a time when his own people had sent out desperate calls for help and heard nothing but static in return. He remembered burying friends not because they'd been shot, but because there was no medicine for a simple infection. He remembered the shame of watching children die while the world debated whether his country was worth saving. Now, watching this distant island suffer the same fate, something inside him hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. "We're going to help them," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The others looked at him stunned. "We barely have enough for ourselves," someone said. "Our own clinics are running on fumes." "I know," he replied, "but that's exactly why we understand what they're going through. We know what it feels like to be forgotten." No grand speeches followed, no press conferences, just a decision made in a room with no cameras, no applause, only the weight of shared pain. Within hours, word spread through the city. Not through official channels, but through whispers in markets, messages passed between neighbors. Notes slipped under doors. People began showing up at collection points, not with fancy supplies, but with what they could spare. A retired engineer donated a water purifier he'd built from scrap metal. A group of students packed boxes with homemade rehydration salts. Nurses volunteered to go, even though they hadn't taken a day off in months. They didn't have cargo planes lined up or government fleets ready to sail. What they had was ingenuity, stubbornness, and a deep unspoken belief. If you've been left behind once, you don't leave others behind. Old fishing boats were patched up and fitted with extra fuel tanks. Military transport planes, rarely used for anything but emergencies, were loaded not with weapons but with medical kits, seeds, and solar lanterns. Mechanics worked through the night, welding broken parts back together, testing engines that hadn't run in years. There was no fanfare, no flags waving, just people doing what they could because they knew what silence sounded like, and they refused to let anyone else hear it. Back on the island, no one knew any of this was happening. They were too busy surviving another day. But in that faraway land, a fleet unlike any the world expected was quietly preparing to move. Not for glory, not for politics, but because someone remembered what it felt like to send a plea into the void and hear nothing come back, and this time they would be the answer. No one believed them at first. When the announcement came, short, plain, and sent through a shaky internet connection, that aid was coming from the so-called Death World, most people outside the island just laughed. News anchors raised their eyebrows. Experts on talk shows called it a publicity stunt or logistically impossible. How could a country barely holding itself together send help to anyone else? They pictured rusted trucks breaking down in the desert or untrained volunteers getting lost at sea. To the powerful nations who'd stayed silent, it was almost an insult, like the poor were trying to do what the rich wouldn't. But while the world doubted, the people in that rugged, sun-baked land were already moving. They didn't have fancy cargo ships or fleets of helicopters. What they had was something harder to measure: experience. They knew how to make clean water from dirty sources because they'd done it for years in their own villages. They knew how to treat wounds without antibiotics because they'd learned out of necessity. They knew how to travel light, move fast, and fix things with whatever was at hand. Skills born not in classrooms, but in survival. Old fishing trawlers, once used to haul nets in rough seas, were emptied of gear and filled with supplies. Their hulls were patched with metal sheets and sealed with tar. Engines that hadn't run in months were coaxed back to life with oil, prayers, and stubbornness. On the docks, volunteers loaded crates marked not with logos, but with hand-painted symbols: a water drop, a cross, a green leaf. In hangars on the edge of a dusty airfield, military cargo planes, rarely used for anything but emergencies, were being filled not with weapons, but with medical kits stitched together by retired nurses, solar lanterns built by students, and bags of fast-growing seeds that could sprout even in poor soil. Every item had been donated, repaired, or handmade. Nothing was wasted. A group of medics gathered in a courtyard at dawn, checking their gear one last time. Most had never left their country before. Some had lost family in past disasters. One young woman packed extra bandages, not because she was told to, but because she remembered her little brother crying from an infected cut that never got proper care. She tucked a small notebook into her bag, filled with sketches of wound treatments she'd learned from village healers. If their doctors are gone, she told a friend, maybe this will help someone remember what to do. There were no speeches before they left. No cameras, just quiet handshakes, shared glances, and the unspoken understanding that they were carrying more than supplies. They were carrying proof that kindness doesn't need wealth to exist. As the first boat pushed off from shore, its engine coughing but steady, a crowd stood on the dock, not cheering, just watching. An old man waved a faded flag. A child held up a drawing of a ship with a red cross on its sail. No one knew if they'd make it. The journey was long, the seas unpredictable, and fuel was limited. But they went anyway. Back on the island, life had settled into a grim routine. People rose before sunrise to collect what little rainwater pooled in broken gutters. Mothers boiled leaves to make weak tea, hoping it would soothe coughs. Children played quietly, their games stripped of laughter, as if joy itself felt like a betrayal of the suffering around them. Then one morning, something changed. A fisherman out on a patched-up raft saw a smudge on the horizon, not a storm cloud, but something solid. He squinted, heart pounding. Was it a trick of the light? He rowed closer, eyes wide. It wasn't one ship. It was 3, and they were heading straight for the island. He paddled back as fast as he could, shouting before he even reached shore. "Ships, real ships, coming this way!" At first no one believed him. Too many false hopes had come and gone. But then others saw them too, dark shapes growing larger against the blue. Not the sleek white vessels of international aid groups, but rough, weathered boats with mismatched paint and patched sails. One flew no national flag, just a simple banner with a hand-drawn symbol. A cup pouring water into another cup, panic mixed with disbelief. Who were they? Were they pirates, soldiers? But as the boats drew closer, people saw the truth. Men and women in simple clothes stood on deck, not with weapons, but with crates in their arms. One held up a white cloth tied to a pole, a universal sign: "We come in peace." When the first boat scraped onto the beach, silence fell over the crowd. Then a woman stepped onto the sand. She carried a medical bag slung over her shoulder and a jug of clean water in her hand. Without a word, she walked to the nearest child, thin, feverish, eyes dull, and knelt beside her. She poured a small cup of water and held it gently to the child's lips. That simple act broke something open in the crowd. Tears came, not from sadness but from shock. Someone was here. Not to take photos, not to make promises, but to do. More people poured off the boats. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask for meetings with officials. They just started working. One group set up a water purification station using filters made from sand and charcoal. Another began sorting medicine under a tarp. A man with a toolbox started fixing the broken hand pump at the village well, humming softly as he worked. An islander approached one of the newcomers, voice trembling. "Why did you come?" No one else did. The visitor looked up, wiped sweat from his brow, and said simply, "Because once no one came for us either." In that moment, something shifted, not just in supplies, but in spirit. For the first time in weeks, people stood a little taller. Children watched with wide eyes as strangers handed out clean bandages and packets of seeds. Elders nodded slowly, as if recognizing a kind of courage they hadn't seen in a long time. The Deathworlders, as the world had mocked them, weren't heroes in uniforms. They were tired, sunburned, and carrying their own scars, but they showed up, with what they had when no one else would, And in doing so, they gave the island something even more precious than medicine or food. They gave them back their dignity. They reminded them they hadn't been forgotten, not by everyone. As the sun set that day, the smell of boiled herbs and clean water filled the air. For the first time in weeks, someone lit a small fire, not for warmth, but to cook a proper meal. And around it, islanders and strangers sat together, not speaking much, but sharing silence that no longer felt empty, just human. The arrival of the strangers didn't just bring supplies, it brought something harder to name. A shift. A breath of air in a room that had been sealed shut for weeks. At first, the islanders watched carefully. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the caution of people who'd been let down too many times. But the newcomers didn't act like typical aid workers. They didn't set up fancy tents with logos, didn't take selfies with the locals, didn't wait for permission to act. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work, side by side with the people who lived there. One of them, a woman with sun-weathered skin and hands rough from years of labor, showed a group of islanders how to build a water filter using layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth. "We use this back home," she said simply. "It's not perfect, but it keeps kids from getting sick." She didn't lecture. She just knelt in the dirt and built one, then handed the next to a teenager to try. Near the ruined clinic, a man who'd once fixed radios in a war zone rigged a solar panel from broken parts to power a small fridge holding vaccines. He worked quietly, muttering to himself until a young islander asked if he could help. The man nodded, handed him a screwdriver, and said, "Hold this wire steady." No titles. No hierarchy. Just two people keeping something alive. What surprised everyone wasn't just what they brought, but how they used it. Their medicine wasn't in fancy boxes. Some of it was grown in small pouches of soil they'd carried in their packs. Their bandages were cut from clean cotton sheets donated by families back home. Even their tools were patched together. Pliers held with tape, stethoscopes with frayed tubes. But everything worked, because they'd learned to make things last. Slowly, trust grew, not through words, but through shared work. Islanders began showing the visitors where the cleanest springs might still be hidden, which paths were safe after the landslides, which elders knew which plants could ease fevers. Knowledge flowed both ways. It wasn't rescue. It was partnership. Then, days later, the big aid groups finally arrived. Shiny white trucks rolled in, escorted by security teams. Drones buzzed overhead. People in crisp uniforms stepped out, holding clipboards and satellite phones. They set up a command tent near the beach and called a meeting with local leaders. "We're here to coordinate the response," one said, as if they hadn't been absent for weeks. But when they looked around, they saw something they hadn't expected. The worst of the crisis was already easing. Clean water stations were running. Makeshift latrines had been dug and covered with lime. Children were receiving basic care under tarps strung between trees. And the people doing it weren't wearing branded vests. They were wearing worn-out shirts and boots held together with string. Some of the newcomers tried to take charge, insisting their methods were more efficient. But the islanders, for the first time in weeks, pushed back gently. "We already have a system," one elder said. "These people taught us how to keep it going." Others from the big group stood quietly watching. A young medic from a wealthy country stared at the charcoal and sand water filter, then at the expensive purification unit sitting unused in his truck. He asked the islanders how it worked. They showed him. He took notes, not for a report, but because he realized something. Sometimes the best solutions aren't the fanciest. They're the ones that work when you have nothing. A few aid workers even started helping, not leading, just joining. They carried supplies alongside the strangers from the death world. They learned how to wrap wounds with the islanders' method, tighter at the base, looser at the top, because it used less cloth and held better in the humidity. They listened more than they spoke, but not everyone was humble. One official tried to claim credit in a press call, saying his organization had stabilized the situation. An islander who overheard just shook his head and walked away. The truth didn't need announcing. It was in the faces of children drinking clean water. In the wells that now gave safe water. In the fact that no one had died from cholera in 5 days. Meanwhile, the original helpers, the ones who'd come first, kept working quietly. They didn't care about headlines. They cared that the old woman in the blue house had enough pain medicine, that the school roof would hold in the next rain, that the seeds they'd brought were already sprouting in small garden plots. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a group of island children gathered around one of the visitors. He was mending a torn tarp, but he paused and pulled out a small wooden flute. He played a simple tune, slow, sad, but warm. The children didn't understand the song, but they sat close, swaying slightly. After a while, one of them hummed along. Then another. Soon it wasn't just his song anymore. It was theirs too. That night, under a sky full of stars, people from two broken places sat together, not as saviors and victims, but as neighbors. They shared a pot of rice cooked over an open flame. No one talked about politics or who deserved credit. They talked about the taste of rain, the sound of birds returning, the way the sea looked calm for the first time in weeks. And in that quiet moment, something powerful took root, not just in the soil but in the hearts of everyone there. The world might have looked away, but these two communities, each scarred by loss, had found each other, and in doing so, they'd proven that help doesn't always come from the powerful. Sometimes it comes from those who remember what it feels like to be left behind and refuse to let it happen to anyone else. Months passed and the island began to breathe again. The mud had dried. New shoots pushed through the soil where seeds had been planted. Roofs patched with tarps and salvaged metal held against the rain. Children ran between houses again, not in fear but in play, their laughter returning like birds after a storm. The worst was over. Not because the world finally showed up, but because help came from a place no one expected, and stayed long enough to make sure recovery took root. One morning, a small boat arrived from the mainland, not carrying aid but passengers. Among them was the island's leader, returning not with empty promises but with purpose. She stepped onto the shore and didn't head for the government tent. She walked straight to the camp where the first helpers had set up. Without fanfare, she sat on a low stool beside one of them, a woman who'd spent weeks teaching islanders how to purify water using nothing but sand and sunlight. They didn't speak at first, just watched a group of teenagers install a new hand pump, laughing as they argued over which wrench to use. Finally, the island leader said, "You didn't just save us. You taught us how to save ourselves." The other woman smiled faintly. "We didn't teach you anything you didn't already know how to learn. You just needed someone to believe you could." That visit wasn't about politics. It was about partnership. Before she left, they signed a simple agreement. Not on fancy paper, but on a reused poster board written in 2 languages. It promised training exchanges. Islanders would travel to learn desert farming and solar repair. Helpers would come back to study coastal resilience and storm-proof building. No big budgets, no flashy announcements. Just people sharing what they knew, because they'd both learned the hard way that survival is a skill, and it's best passed hand to hand. Back in the wider world, something quiet began to shift too. News outlets that had once mocked the death world now ran stories about its grassroots aid model. Medical students in far-off cities studied their low-tech wound care methods. Engineers took notes on how they powered clinics with salvaged parts. Not because it was trendy, but because it worked. And it worked with almost nothing. The term Deathworlders didn't disappear, but its meaning changed. It stopped being a label of pity or fear. Now when people said it, there was respect in their voices. It meant, these are the ones who show up when no one else will. On the island, life wasn't back to how it was before the storm. That would never happen. But it was becoming something new. Stronger in different ways. A school had reopened in a rebuilt hall, its walls painted with murals of boats, trees, and hands reaching across water. In one corner, a small shelf held books sent by students from the helping country, handwritten guides on growing food in poor soil, treating fevers with local plants, building shelters from scrap. One afternoon, a group of children gathered near the shore, not to search for wreckage but to plant mangrove saplings. Their fingers dug into the wet sand, carefully placing each young tree. Beside them stood a few of the original helpers, now fewer in number as most had returned home, but still here, still teaching. One showed a boy how to angle the roots so the tide wouldn't wash them away. "These trees," he said, "will protect your island long after we're gone." The boy nodded, patting the soil gently. "Will you come back?" "Maybe," the man said. "But you won't need us to. You'll teach the next ones," and that was the real victory. Not the crates of medicine or the repaired wells, but the knowledge that had taken root in people. The islanders weren't just surviving. They were preparing. They'd built rainwater catchers from old gutters. They'd trained local teens as first responders. They'd started a seed bank using the fast-growing crops their friends had brought. They were ready, not for the world to save them, but to save each other. Meanwhile, in the land that had once been called broken, life continued its hard, steady rhythm. But something had changed there too. When news came that another small community, this time in a mountain village hit by landslides, sent out a quiet plea, people didn't wait for governments to act. They gathered in the same courtyard, packed the same kind of crates, and prepared the same kind of boats. Because now they knew, help doesn't have to come from the top. It can rise from the ground, from those who've known hunger, loss, and silence and refused to let others drown in it. Years later, travelers passing through the island would notice something unusual. Near the harbor, where the first boats had landed, there was a small stone circle, not a monument to heroes, but a gathering place. On calm evenings, elders and children would sit there telling stories. Not just about the storm, but about the strangers who came when the world looked away. And every planting season, without fail, islanders and their faraway friends would meet, sometimes in person, sometimes through crackling video calls, and share what they'd learned. A new way to filter water, a stronger type of roof, a song that helped calm frightened children during thunder. The world never apologized for its silence. But the island didn't need an apology. It had something better, proof that kindness doesn't require wealth, power, or permission. It only requires one person to hear a cry for help and choose to answer. And so, in the quiet rhythm of daily life, hands in soil, voices in song, shared meals under open skies, the island healed. Not by forgetting the storm, but by building something that could weather the next one, together. Because in the end, it wasn't the powerful who saved them. It was the ones who knew what it meant to be left behind and refused to let anyone else feel that alone again.